Okay, so for my alteration of clue, if 6 other players were playing, they would each choose a character. As per usual, Miss Scarlet would go first. As per usual, the characters would be moving along the board based on the die roll to get to the rooms. The difference is, instead of all the players having cards, only the GM in this instance, the Game Master, as though this were D&D, would have the cards. They would, ahead of time, sort out what weapon would be in what room. Obviously, some rooms wouldn't have weapons. And they would create a little story, like, you know, oh, such and such a character was in such and such a room doing such and such a thing prior, you know, to set everything up prior to the murder happening. You would try to, you know, influence the players' minds to try and see who it is that committed the murder. And of course, you would take, you know, each player off to the side, or however you would want to do it, so that this way you can tell them, you know, you're the murderer, you're not the murderer. And generally everyone's trying to keep that a secret. Whether they're the murderer or not, you don't want people saying anything like that. So we're just going to very basically and randomly make sure I did that right. Set up weapons, rooms, stuff like that. So that each character has something that they were in a room with to try and set up the cards. And obviously not every room is going to have something going on in it, but red herrings are what make mystery novels so amazing. So we'll just pretend to be Miss Scarlet for now. We would roll. We would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Can't get in the room right now. So on and so forth. 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'll say that. So now this character, Colonel Mustard in this instance, would try to roll for investigation. Since 2 6-sided die, to make it easier for the first clue to be found, he's in the dining room. You would roll anything above a 6. I have no idea where the dining room is. This was a mistake in terms of doing things. Should probably flip these. So, dining room. So I rolled above a 6 for the first clue. So the GM would be able to just, you know, pick ahead of time. Miss Orchid was in the room doing such and such a thing, so you would have to move Miss Orchid over there. It's kind of like the suggestion normally in that you move the item, so in this case, we haven't revealed the item yet. But the GM would then create a little story such as, oh, she was in the dining room getting, there's spilt wine there, let's make it easy. Off the top of my head, she was getting some wine when she heard commotion going on, spilt the wine, and ran out into the room. Something simple like that. Keep the play going. Generally, you know, it's the same rules. You just move everyone around, try and figure out everything. Everyone would still have the same notepad. The exception is that, you know, you're trying to roll into the room, and you're trying to roll, like, we'll say Colonel Mustard comes back in, and he gets an 8. So he's able to reveal the second clue. So in this room was a dagger. Obviously, you don't want to try and pin any of the players as the murderer just yet, so you would try to say something like, oh, it was a ceremonial dagger that was passed down from generation to generation because, I don't know, their ancestor was Ezio or something, and they were assassins. But in reference to the player who's the murderer, we'll say it was Dr. Orchid. Dr. Orchid's trying to go around and murder off the other players. So we'll say it's in the same room as Colonel Mustard. You're trying to roll above an 8. In this instance, it was a 7. So what happens is that the GM is trying to work with the murderer to stay hidden. So the GM would go, oh, it's above a 7. So we'll say it happened, we'll say they're in the kitchen. So it's like, oh yeah, you know, you don't reveal these, you just slide it over to the player. The player who's a murderer doesn't care what's on this card, they're just going to keep playing as though they are, so they're going to keep filling this out and acting normal until they get, just not getting these rolls. Alright, until they get a 10. It's anything above an 8, so the GM and the murderer would both know Colonel Mustard is dead. So we'll say Colonel Mustard has almost the entire sheet filled out, and so he's basically able to use process of elimination to say, alright, I'm going to make an accusation. If he's already been murdered, the GM would announce however it is that the GM wants to say the player got murdered. So this way they can't make the accusation, so their clues that they figured out can't be hinted to the other people in order to keep the murderer safe. Because if they say, oh, it was such and such a person in such and such a room with such and such a weapon, then it's going to give the other players more information on who the murderer is, and the goal is for the murderer to either knock out all the players or make it so that no one can make a safe accusation or a correct accusation. And it's the same as in normal Clue. If you make a wrong accusation, you're out. The GM knowing who the murderer is and in what room and such that they did it, because I mean they would decide ahead of time. If it's wrong, then they slide those cards over. They slide the real cards over to the player who's making the accusation, or if it's right. And then the player looks at them. If they're right, flip them over, win. If it's wrong, pass them back to the GM. And that's basically the wrap-up. Depending on if the murderer won or if the correct accusation is made, the GM, adds a little flavor, explaining how it is that the murderer was caught or how the murderer got away. Just to add a little narrative to everything. It also just makes things different because every time the GM would be a different person or the GM would just come up with a different story. So it keeps things varied, it keeps things new, it keeps things fresh, and yeah, it adds the aesthetic of narrative to everything without having to get bogged down in reading cards that are predetermined story and stuff like that. It lets the most creative person in your friend group kind of just go on, just like in D&D or Pathfinder or any of those games.